Gracias por estar con nosotros un día más en este ciclo de conferencias Mujeres y Políticas Públicas. El día de hoy nos acompaña Linda Kumalo y Caitlin Blazer Mapizza. Linda es una evaluadora experimentada e investigadora postdoctoral en la Universidad de Amberes. Su investigación se centra en la intersección de los estudios de desarrollo, la evaluación y la teoría decolonial. Se centra en abordar asimetrías epistémicas entre el norte y el sur global. Linda investiga cómo los conocimientos indígenas pueden integrarse significativamente en la evaluación de programas para promover resultados de desarrollo socialmente justos y contextualmente relevantes. Su trabajo se basa en la teoría crítica interdisciplinaria para analizar las dinámicas de poder en la producción de conocimiento. Por otra parte, Caitlin Mapizza es profesora asociada de monitoreo y evaluación en la Escuela de Gobernanza de la Universidad de Witwatersrand. No sé si lo pronuncié bien. Si bien se mantiene al tanto de la práctica de la evaluación y busca maneras de fortalecer las sinergias entre comunidades de investigación y evaluación, su investigación se centra principalmente en la gobernanza transfronteriza tanto de la tierra como de las personas. Está interesada principalmente en comprender qué impulsa el cambio en sistemas sociales y ecológicos complejos y qué herramientas pueden ayudarnos mejor a comprender estos cambios. Tiene una maestría y un doctorado en migración. Linda, Caitlin, thank you for being with us. I just made the presentation in Spanish, so I hope you you could understand a little bit. So, who want to start?
Um, Maybe let me start by sharing the screen for a brief presentation. And I think to turn over to Linda to give a little bit of background to the topic.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting us to this important talk. We're glad to be part of it. So I'll just start with a brief background to just guide everyone through how we got here to talk about indigenous knowledge systems and why it's important. So basically this stems from the fact that the development agendas that we see in the African context and beyond that are still very much driven by Western knowledges. And there's still the idea of development being something that is brought from the north to the south, using tools that are often not designed in the context for which they are brought. So there's tend to be not contextually appropriate and sometimes not relevant as well. And we know that evaluation is well placed in its role in determining not only what counts as success, but how we value different outcomes and programs and how we understand change or what we prioritize in that regard. Yet in our context in the African continent, we still see that evaluation is still shaped by these dominant Western paradigms. So the field is increasingly being scrutinized from different angles around that. What does it really mean to be transformative? What does it really mean to address social inequalities? So as a result, there has been in the past decades a huge wave on decolonizing. And I mean, it's not just in evaluation, it also is very much linked to the development field itself to question exactly what approaches are we using, what do we mean when we say evaluation is contextually relevant. And this has led us to really talk about Made in Africa evaluation, which is really thinking about what evaluation means from an African-centric perspective. How does it mean to redefine exactly what tools, what approaches, what values inform how we see evaluation as a field? And in that, there's a lot of cultural sensitivity, and talking about locally based approaches. And this is where indigenous knowledge systems are really well placed to talk about this. And of course, we cannot ignore that the value is well acknowledged in different fields as well, that indigenous knowledge systems are valuable, that we need to understand what local communities view as important. But there's still the question of the legitimization. So to what extent those ways of knowing are actually prioritized. And so central to this shift, which I speak about, the wave of decolonizing, is the idea of legitimizing and applying the indigenous knowledge systems in evaluation. So this is where our work has been really in trying to ask these questions about evaluation itself, interrogating what is being measured, which tools and approaches are being used, how change is being understood, and what knowledge informs the dominant narrative. And so indigenous knowledge systems provides a lens through which we understand the ways of knowing of communities that provide value in valuing evaluation. As we know, evaluation is very much centered on value judgment itself. So the question of whose realities count and what values are prioritized. So in our work, really, we've been at the forefront of trying to understand this shift of how do we bring indigenous knowledge systems beyond just acknowledging them, but bringing them to the fore in like a practical sense, in embracing not just what we have as the mainstream evaluation, but bringing it in a pluriversal way, like we talk about integrating the indigenous knowledge systems. And so evaluating change through local perspectives is, in this case, important if we're talking about evaluation as being transformative. So this is where we've been. So to do that, I'll just talk briefly about some of the work that we have been doing. We talk a lot about indigenous knowledge systems. It doesn't only stem from, I think in evaluation, it's been in the last decade, we're talking a lot more, but it still appears that it's still a buzzword, meaning that each of us understands differently, but it's really something we talk about more and more, but we don't really have a consolidated meaning in evaluation. So we've been very excited to be part of an edited book where we are trying to bring these different understandings together. It has been quite the experience because we are trying to bring all these different case studies, not just, we started this, of course, being scholars on Made in Africa evaluation, but realizing that actually we have a lot to share and a lot to learn within each other, like in Latin America and South Asia as well, that also have a lot of different indigenous knowledge systems that they are also applying and also trying to bring to the fore. So we've been working on this volume since just over a year ago. And it's something that is nearing completion, happy to say. But in this book, the idea is to now bring this, documentation in evaluation. What are we actually talking about? Why does it matter? And what does it look like? You see, because it's still quite abstract for some of us, like what it means conceptually, but also how it can be applied. So this is something exciting that we're working on, really, to clarify those conceptual understandings in evaluation. So as also part of my postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Antwerp, I'm doing something similar as well. But what I'm doing here is an opportunity to speak to evaluators that are working in applying some of these approaches. So, for example, like we'll talk about in the next slides, some different approaches like using proverbs in evaluation, what kind of culturally sensitive ways of doing evaluation are we piloting? Because we feel that it's difficult to find the tangible in this space. We talk and we appreciate the value, but we want to move to understanding how to apply and what people are actually doing. And this is going to be important as well to building theory around indigenous knowledges in evaluation. So this is also an exciting research, which is also looking at understanding in the integration of the indigenous knowledge systems, how does this play out with key actors? I mean, we have institutional arrangements already around what is expected in evaluation, how are we standardizing, and what conventional ways of doing things are there, and basically how do we negotiate around that, and what outcomes and for whom are being realized. So this is some of the practical work that's happening research-wise, but also quite documenting the practice side. I'll move to Caitlin now.
Great, thanks. I mean, I think one of the first hurdles we found in trying to find a way of working together around this was really finding a conceptual meeting point between indigenous knowledge systems and systems for transformative evaluation. And I think one of the reasons, there were a number of reasons why it was quite challenging. And I think it's because different people put the boundaries of both systems in different places. So some people who speak about indigenous knowledge systems, for example, locate it primarily within really specific technical areas. They're working in, for example, natural resource management or issues of climate change or ecology. And similarly, within transformative evaluation, some people draw the boundaries around specific methods, tools, or approaches, for example. But not everybody puts the boundaries in the same place. So finding that there were really different ways of viewing indigenous knowledge and evaluation systems made it quite tricky to figure out where the points of overlap and commonality were, and also where the points of divergence were. But where we landed on this is that there were four primary areas where the two of them intersect quite a lot in the development sector broadly. One is around issues of power and ownership. So, of course, for evaluation to transform, this has to engage with how change happens, with who holds power, and with how we see that shifting. And similarly, indigenous knowledge systems have a history of marginalization, and for their integration to be meaningful, there has to be a movement in that. So there was a lot of, I would say, complementarity between the way indigenous knowledge systems and transformative evaluation tackle issues of power and ownership. And similarly, around values, I think there was a lot of agreement and consensus that both indigenous knowledge systems and transformative evaluation are primarily values driven. And, there might be some differences about, the context and the way you define those values in different situations. But there was again quite a lot of consensus around a need for principles and values to underpin the integration of both in programmatic work. Now, where we found a little bit of divergence is around the way knowledge is seen and data is treated. I think the issue of knowledge sovereignty and ownership is really critical for Indigenous knowledge systems discourse because there's this history of dispossession of the knowledge from the knowledge holders, for example. And similarly, I think one of the things the evaluation sector struggles with, particularly in conventional development programming, is that, there's this stakeholder constellation of the commissioners of the evaluation who are, paying the money and holding the contract, and therefore are the owners of the data. Even though, of course, the people whose lived experiences are being drawn on to generate that data hold it in a different way. And so this balance of what we consider data, where it comes from, who it belongs to, and who ought to have the rights to it, is something that's quite heavily contested. And it's an area where I think transformative evaluation could learn quite a lot from a lot of the discourse happening around Indigenous knowledge systems, in that it would help position this issue of data as transformative in a way that I think could be really beneficial. And around the tools of practice, this was an area where there was some convergence and some divergence. Again, depending on how the different systems were defined and where the boundaries were drawn. I think both within transformative evaluation discourse and Indigenous knowledge systems discussions, there's often kind of a disjuncture between, on one hand, needing to make things very concrete. When we talk about evaluations that engage with Indigenous knowledge systems, for example, there are often methods and approaches that go with that. It can include, storytelling narratives, oral histories, often very anthropological methods and approaches. And yet at the same time, I think there's the possibility and the opportunity to surface some of the relational issues and a lot of the understanding of Indigenous knowledge systems using other tools and techniques that evaluation has at its disposal. So I think one of the areas where there's maybe some of the best opportunity for collaboration between the two fields is on figuring out how you make the connections between the really tangible data, whether it's stories, whether it's surveys, whether it's processes of participation and engagement, and then going through the process of meaning making, of analysis, and of trying to identify what the important and salient lessons are, because that's a process that passes through its own knowledge systems. And very often, that's where a sort of disconnect or breakdown occurs in the way we understand how Indigenous knowledge can be an evaluation, and then how it actually emerges on the other side. I think one of the things we saw a lot in the research is, I think, frustration, both from evaluators and from Indigenous knowledge holders, that there's very rich description, participation, engagement in evaluation processes. And yet it's increasingly difficult to integrate this systemically in the evaluation results, in the way use happens, in the way design takes place. So trying to figure out, where this sits across the two systems, I think is an ongoing conversation and debate. So we just took a couple concrete examples that are drawn from chapters of the books. So they came from other contributors to help kind of ground some of this in practice. We didn't want to be too academic because otherwise it's so easy to get lost in the concepts and the jargon. And it can be useful to really, look specifically at what we're talking about. So over to you, Linda.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. So one of the main examples that we picked from the book is the use of proverbs. So we have proverbs in different indigenous groups in different languages. And of course, these are ways that we receive wisdom in different cultures. So in some of our cultures, like for me growing up, it was how you knew what to avoid or how to be around people, how to relate to people. So proverbs are also a very important evaluative framework because they are an expression of everyday life and how decision making happens around not just households but communities. So that makes them very important in evaluative lens because they help with ethical judgment, accountability, and learning. So we have in this chapter a really interesting case of using Shona proverbs, which is an indigenous group in Zimbabwe where proverbs are used, basically also showing that evaluation is not just an external process, but that communities are already self-evaluating through their lived practices. So they use these words of wisdom to reflect amongst themselves. I will give some examples on how we as evaluators can learn from these processes. So it's not a separate process, but it is already embedded in how people live and how they reflect and how they participate in development already and how they define change. So for example, looking at collective assessment and mutual responsibility through, I will speak it, but then I will not, I will translate it in English through one very common proverb that says, Rume, Rimwe, Hari, Kombi, Churu. So basically, one person cannot surround an ant, which basically means that there needs to be different collectivity, different collective wisdom to take responsibility for action. So it really emphasizes mutual responsibility in everything that the community is doing. And another interesting, also very popular is that speaks about that a child who does not cry dies in the cradle. Basically, that the importance of voice. So this is also an important evaluative element, that if you do not provide feedback loops and have accountability, therefore you do not have a true sense of what exactly people have, like people value. So it's also an important way of understanding that for evaluation to be meaningful, it's about creating spaces where everyone, not just certain people, but everyone can speak and contest, not just agree, but also contest on what are their needs and what is not being met, in the same way that a baby that doesn't cry can die in its cradle. So that importance of speaking out. And of course, that means active listening as well, because who's listening to the baby, so to say. So just this shows different ways of valuing, ways of knowing in communities through proverbial wisdom, which is how people communicate and how they understand, how they relate to each other in this sense. Another example.
Sorry, I just had to get to my microphone. Yes. So another example draws on a case study from Bangladesh around the medicine wheel. And the medicine wheel is actually a context that doesn't only occur in that geographic footprint. I think variations of it have come through indigenous knowledge systems in many regions, which also makes it quite interesting for comparison. And, you know, going back to value systems as a commonality across a number of different geographies, I think holistic approaches certainly come out as something that are widely held regardless of context. And so the medicine wheel, there was a sort of participatory action research approach in an evaluation to embed this medicine wheel in a local health initiative. And what came out of it, I would say, were two or three things. So some of it was understanding of the wheel itself, which I think was unique because not only did it provide like quite a holistic approach to individual health, so integrated physical and mental and spiritual well-being quite broadly. It also viewed individual health in the context of the community and the environment. So it was really an acknowledgement that, you know, the physical well-being of an individual isn't only dependent on individual choices, activities, genetics, you know, on the physical outcomes of one particular person, but it happens in a context, I think. And On one hand, I think the evaluators came out being really, I think, impressed and motivated by the level of detail and engagement and logic that this organizing principle brought to the initiative. And at the same time, possibly a bit frustrated at how challenging it was to truly integrate systemic approaches into programmatic work. So I think they had an ongoing concern that so often within evaluation, engagement with indigenous knowledge systems is primarily an extractive process. We want to describe it, we want to understand it, but how do we then feed back into it through the resourcing, through allowing leadership, voice, agency in planning going forward, when actually the power and ownership for resources for project planning sits somewhere else? And I think their takeaway was neither ultimately hopeful nor ultimately pessimistic, but really problematized the challenges that the current development sector faces in finding this meaningful relationship and fundamentally enacting transformative evaluation, right? Because that's what it requires. And I think one of the things that we tried to do at regular basis as we were, trying to raise these issues was to step back a little bit and consider the political economy in which evaluation is happening and the historical context. So, I mean, one of the reasons this conversation came about actually is because the Made in Africa evaluation approaches and conversations, I think, have gotten quite a lot of currency and engagement and uptake on the global stage. And I think African evaluators, let me not speak for all of us, but felt a certain frustration about the way the conversation was getting stuck. Because we all have agreement that it's important. We all have an agreement that it's valuable, that this integration is critical to making evaluation effective, that it needs practical tools, that it's something that should absolutely be prioritized. And yet, we're so often unable to do it because of the structures within the evaluation system that make this meaningful integration difficult. So, all of the things that have marginalized Indigenous knowledge systems in the past are still in place, making the achievement of transformation through evaluation complicated. And what we were hoping is that by reaching out to other parts of the global south who haven't been part of the collective Made in Africa evaluation conversations, we could get sort of nudged over the bump of speaking to ourselves about our own frustrations and being able to learn from each other a little bit. And I think there's so many commonalities in our political economic context from colonial histories, extractive states and institutions, and really the problem of evaluation fundamentally being embedded within these, which has worked so much against making transformation and making evaluations work for Indigenous knowledge holders and for systems that can actually change power. So what we're really asking ourselves in these processes are how we can make these linkages between transformation and evaluation practice, because this is so often where we see things getting stuck. Both Indigenous knowledge holders and evaluation practitioners have, I would say, the background, the will, the understanding, the engagement, even the resourcing to, come together and move this in the right direction. But the institutional forces pushing against it are also very strong. So it's about how we can collaboratively manage this and what we can learn through dialogue with each other, hopefully to allow us both to reach our objectives more successfully. And I think these are questions that work well across different geographies, sectors, and contexts. Yeah, and that is the end for us.
Thank you so much, Linda and Caitlin. This is very, this is a very rich talk because you've been sharing with us very important statements on evaluation also on public policies. For example, here in Latin America, we've been discussing about uh, this concept epi ep epistemicide. It's something like it's the killing of a way of thinking. That's because all the indigenous knowledge being killed in hundreds of years. We made the the Western way of life, or we try to convert us more like the Americans or the Europe in North, uh, and a lot of indigenous people and a lot of indigenous community try to preserve their knowledge. And for instance, we have only 160 something like that languages, indigenous languages in Mexico, but we lost a lot of them in this hundred of years. So the colonial approach, the colonial way of think is trying to make a switch in the way we think on the indigenous thinking. For example, the all the last century, and we try to integrate the indigenous communities to the state, but that in order to make that, we try to erase their language, their culture, and that was a really bad idea, you know. And now we have another way to think about it, and we are trying to recovering indigenous thinking and all these epistemologies they can offer, and we are trying to make a switch in also in public policies and the way the citizens make involved in evaluation, in order to make it more participatory, more you know, trying to know better our citizens, not just as clients, for example, uh, because now we understand that all citizens are the real owners of the public policy, not just clients. So sometimes in public policy, for example, in the last century, we make greater the inequality between cultures, regions, geographical regions, and also with some people, you know, with some communities. For example, I went to Chihuahua. This is a state in Mexico. This is a big state, and I went to visit the indigenous community of Raramuri, and this is Tarahumara Sierra. And for example, I was like really astonished because I found some localities where people live since, I don't know, maybe 1,000 years or more, I don't know. And we have in Mexico the National Coordination for Fiscal Federalism, and we have laws. And these laws tell the states and the municipalities they have to give the resources, the financial resources, to the poorest localities, to the poorest. And when I was doing this work in field, I found localities with indigenous communities, and they don't have any how can I say it, any administrative registration in the national list of localities. So I was like really astonished, you know, because I was in localities with people, with families, then they don't have water by the public service, and they don't have electricity, and they don't have. And I was like, I was trying to understand why is this kind of poverty. And if you read the Western literature, maybe you can find some, how can I say it, prejudices on poverty, on people who is poor. And for example, here in Mexico, we have this bad idea that the poor wants to live as poor, you know? That is the mainstream idea, the erroneous, the something that is not true. But in the deep, when I was trying to understand why, I found that these localities, they don't have any registration in the list, in the national list of localities. So when you have a law that tells the states or the municipality, you have to give the financial resources to the poorest localities, but you don't know where is the poorest localities, where because they don't exist in the administrative list. Well, you cannot give the money because they don't exist. And you have to put the geographical coordinate when you are making a work. For example, if you construct a school or a hospital, you have to put the geographical coordinate. So it doesn't, if it doesn't correspond to the poorest localities, you are making a bad use of the money. And maybe as a president in the municipality or the governor in the state, they they can go to jail because they are using a bad way the money. So we have a really, 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 really bad system in the way we transfer money because we are trying to reduce inequalities, but we don't know really how big is this inequality or where are the poorest ones. And here in Mexico, we have the poorest localities, the poorest in the indigenous communities. That's for sure. That's for sure. Kirlin?
Yes, I mean, it's so interesting to me the way this interface happens between, the expectations of the bureaucracy and of the state and the lived realities of indigenous communities. And it seems like there's so much will on both sides to find meeting points that will have positive outcomes for everyone. And yet there are so many barriers to making it possible. And I think um, this is really something that evaluators particularly are running into time and time again. The state is acting with good principles and goodwill of trying to value indigenous knowledge, of trying to, allocate resources to marginalized communities. And yet somehow the structures are making it difficult. And similarly, indigenous communities are trying to create spaces for positive engagement to build trust that, there won't be co-option, that these, efforts at participation are meaningful and are genuine. And yet all of these historicized systems of practice and these like deeply, deeply ingrained ways of thinking and systems of exclusion are incredibly difficult to overcome. And I mean, I think one of the things that we're hoping for is to identify some areas of like true partnership where this engagement, where these barriers have been overcome and where we've seen really transformative change, because I do think we have seen examples of them and we haven't quite figured out yet what is it that catalyzes this? What's unique about the context, about the individuals, about the history of the communities or the institutions that makes it possible in some cases and still very challenging in others.
we face a lot of different cultures in Mexico. For example, in Oaxaca, we have Zapoteca culture, and they preserve Tequio. Tequio is a way of each individual in the community has to make an effort to help in the works. For example, in the cleaning the streets when they are young, or watching the streets when they are kind of older, or they have to be a mayor of the community, of the municipality, when they get older. Tequio is a very important institution in Zapoteca culture. And also they have, for example, in some other communities like Mije culture, they have this community assembly. And this is, I think, a very sophisticated way of accountability, because all the community make this organization in front of the authorities, and they decide if they want to continue some programs, some municipal programs, some work, some allocation of resources, of the municipality. So I think each culture has a lot of offer to the science of public administration and public policy, and also in evaluation. Linda?
Mm, thank you so much. It was interesting to hear that context. I was just thinking as you were talking about the efforts in basically redefining and recovering, bringing together the indigenous thinking, what some of the approaches that you found were maybe working around that, and some of the challenges. For example, I would think immediately of the languages being lost and the difficulty in like translating and documenting, also brings us back to the challenge of trying to westernize it so that it's relevant, and in the process losing the essence of the meaning. So what do you find has been working, or is at least work in progress? I know it's not easy to do that. Yeah.
Yes, this is very difficult to make, because a lot of languages in Latin America, they don't have alphabet. So it's really hard to teach some of these languages. For example, in Spanish, we have the Real Academia de la Lengua in Spain, and if we are making a bad use of the Spanish language, the Real Academia will tell us, no, that doesn't work like that. But for Zapoteca language, we don't have the Real Academia de la Lengua Zapoteca. So each community that they speak Zapoteca make the natural evolution of the language very different. And sometimes they are very close, but they have kind of different languages, and it's the same Zapoteca language, but we don't have like a school that they tell us Zapoteca it has to be like this, or Mije has to be like this, or Ranamuri has to be like this. So we have a lot of people is making great efforts, and make let me share my screen, because in some days we will be talking on this. I don't know if you see it. Yes, you can see it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is a handbook teaching the Masawa language. And we will present it in some days here in the Colegio Mexiquense. And for example, this is the Masawa, Weji Yo Yaju Natro. I don't know if I pronounce it like very well, but this is like an effort I found interest interesting, because this is from Ana Elvia Paulino Escamilla. She's a teacher in the university, Intercultural University from the state of Mexico, and she's trying to make a handbook. I will. I don't know if. Sorry. Yeah. This is a handbook, like these handbooks of teaching English, for example, where you have. Well, this is the introduction, of course. You have the songs where you can find all. You can find Mazahua's people in the state of Mexico. And I love this handbook because it will tell you like some concepts, but also some vocabulary in the life. But also, for example, this is like the idea of the handbook uh, when you are learning, for example, English or French or I don't know, like this. But also this Ana Elvia teacher, uh, I love her work because she also tried to share about the Mazahua way of life. For example, making tortilla. Tortilla is one of this is the bread we make with maize. And she also have some examples of making tortilla for learning Mazahua language. And I think this effort is very beautiful, very, very beautiful, because you also you you know vocabulary, but also institutions. Let me show you the example. This is the example. This is making tortilla, and I love it. I love it because this is so cultural. So this is an example, very beautiful. It's so cultural, so very. How can I say it? I don't know. I cannot find the words. And I think that, of course, if you ask me to pronounce this sentence, I will. Maybe I cannot. But for that reason, these kind of exercises will need something like a help with with a CD or something like this to in order to to hear how you should pronounce. And I found these examples a beautiful way of not just only preserve the language or the knowledge, but also to share some institutions that you can find in these cultural systems or political systems. I don't know, Caitlin, what do you think?
I'm worried now to share my thoughts, or Linda won't agree to come to other presentations with me because it always gives me ideas for more work. But as you were talking and sharing both this manual and also talking about the Zapotecan, democratic institutions, it made me reflect a little bit that when we look at the marginalization of indigenous cultures and the knowledge systems that sit with them, very often we think about the things that are visible. We think about language, about cultural practices, or knowledge about natural resource management or engagement with a specific place. But we also have localized systems of governance, of democratic engagement, and of organization. And I think maybe one of the things that we often overlook in the evaluation sector is figuring out how to surface these in a way that's meaningful. That these knowledge systems, aren't only about, I mean, they include technical issues around education, around health, around, all areas of knowledge. And one of those areas of knowledge is the relational, about how governance happens, how power is distributed. And I think that's something that evaluators could really learn a lot from. And as we look at, how government can meaningfully encourage participation, maybe learning first and informing ourselves and creating research and information about what's currently already happening, what is threatened, why is it threatened, and why is there this mismatch? Certainly, I think in many areas in Southern Africa, which is the place that I know, there's an expectation that local development planning should happen by people coming into municipal processes. And the ability of municipalities to bring people into their processes has been really, I would say, quite limited. There are some examples of success, but I think there might be more success if municipalities considered how they could be brought in to the way participation is already happening in communities. And I think that might look quite different. So that can be the next book, Linda.
Sounds great.
Maybe it's a collaboration with you, Juan.
Please, please. And I have a question. Here, the colonial thought in Latin America had a really close relation with religion, with Catholic religion. This the colonial way of thinking, for example, how can I say it, made an effort in the last century to open the Catholic religion to indigenous people, for example. And we in Catholic, the Vatican made the Concilio Vaticano II, that's the Vatican Council, the second, and a lot of Marxist ideas and all of ideas from the left, they become like effervescent in the colonial thinkers. For example, we have Enrique Dussel, Walter Mignolo, Ramon Grossfogel, and these thinkers, if you read it, they have a lot of ideology and a lot of philosophy, but also a lot of Marxism and a lot of theology of liberation. And I have the question, what about in Africa, for example? You have a very cool, a lot of cultures, a lot of religions, not only Catholic, I mean the Muslims and some other way of thinking. How is the colonial thinking in Africa or some countries in Africa?
Ooh, this is an interesting question and one we haven't talked about, so we might actually have different views. But my it's not an area that I know a lot about, but what I do know, I think suggests that more often than not, religion Christian religion, at least, was introduced as part of the colonial process and remains very strongly embedded in discourses of extraction, in discourses of control, in discourses of integration into Western thought and capitalist extraction, kind of all in one machine. And I think some theology has gotten stuck there. I do think there has been a sort of counter movement to find ways of integrating, for example, indigenous beliefs into Christian practices. And I think probably this melting pot might be the majority, but I think it's been an uncomfortable relationship, I think. And I wouldn't say in general that religion has been a progressive social force from that perspective generally. But again, with the caveat that Africa is very big and very diverse, and religions have different practices and different shapes in different places. I don't know, Linda, what do you think?
Yeah, I was going to say more that from my experience, the introduction of, not really introduction, but the openness of what we might call African traditional religion, which again means different things in different African contexts in the last decades, I think has shown to be a form of resistance to what Caitlin is saying, that we feel that some of these religions and some of the ideologies around them are very colonial and therefore redefining. And interestingly, people choosing both or taking a bit of what they decide works for them in the Christian ideology, but also being very much linking the traditional religion to their sense of being. So it's like a way of embracing Africanness as well. So ancestral worship. So maybe back then, something that may have been considered backward and exotic, but is being embraced more. I think it's part of the decolonial shift. You see that being embraced more and even linked with health, how people feel traditional herbs are also spiritually sent and they're not, they are almost a calling to certain beings. So I think there's some embracing there of this decolonizing what we knew as colonial religion and redefining in our own ways. Yeah.
Yes, I think that I found really important this movement made in Africa, made in Africa evaluation, and I think in Latin America we couldn't create something like that. We have this the colonial turn, where, as I repeat, it became more ideological, Marxist, and something like that. I don't know. And people is in Latin America because we have, like these dictatorships. We are not like really into this ideology, like Marxist ideology. Um, well, some people is not, and but I think in Latin America or also in some other regions, some other continents, we have a lot of to learn about Made in Africa evaluation movement in order to create like not like a different way of thinking, because to recover our epistemology or the epistemology of our communities. And when you were talking about the proverbs in here we have in Nahuatl language is Mexicatiahui tlaquenahuaque, yupimapiwa. That means brother Mexica. Mexica is Mexican, like before. Brother Mexica, we are closer than the fingers of a hand. That's the way of make the idea that community in Nahuatl people. So thank you so much for being with us, Linda and Caitlin. Do you have some last message you want to share with us? We can start with Linda, maybe.
Yeah, I'm interested in exploring these approaches like that you said you are still also trying to discover what the made in Africa is, the made in Latin America is for you. So just as a next step, something that we could think about as made in Africa is also an ongoing discourse as well. So I think given our similarities from listening to you earlier, we have a lot to learn and share with each other.
Thank you. Caitlin,
Yes, I think I would just like to agree and consider this the start of a conversation rather than the end of one. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
thank you so much. Well, I have a lot in my mind because of your talk. I found it really, really, really beautiful and really, really, really interesting. Thank you so much for being with us. See you next time.
Thank you. See you
Thank
next time.
you. Bye.
Bye.